Evergrande, the second largest Chinese real estate development company, is on the brink of collapse and unable to repay its astronomical $300 billion debt. You're starting to see more and more headlines about it in the news, and for good reason. The Chinese real estate sector at large accounts for 29% of the country's GDP and has been the main driver of economic growth for a while. And since China itself is a driver of global economic growth, you can see here how a potential default of Evergrande might trigger quite an unpleasant chain reaction, to say the least. The bigger problem is that Evergrande is most likely not the only such company in trouble. For example, here's the market value of Cynic, a smaller real estate development company whose stock price went down by 87% in just one day. Years of stability and then boom, all gone. Just like this Redditor coins it, this is not ideal market behavior, and I think that we can all agree. Now that the stage is set, let's see in detail what's going on with the Chinese real estate market and how it might potentially impact you directly in the coming weeks. For starters, Chinese people love real estate for many reasons. First of all, because of gender imbalance, there is an excess of 300 million men, which puts women in a position of power to select their future partner, and naturally, they have bigger expectations. Owning a home almost becomes a prerequisite for men to marry, which therefore puts pressure on real estate prices. Second, China doesn't offer enough interesting options for personal investments to its population, such as stock and bond markets, which makes real estate the overwhelming go-to asset. And indeed, a wildly appreciating asset has it been. Chinese real estate prices have been consistently rising every year by 4 to 15% depending on the cities, and in some places the average home price to income ratios have gone through the roof, doubling even the notoriously expensive cities like Singapore, London, and Paris. Also, to benefit from price speculation, Chinese have been buying a lot of second and even third homes, proportions of which have been increasing, and families would hoard and gather money to help children and grandchildren buy their own property. Often people would buy any kind of property whatsoever and let it sit empty, simply because they had the assurance to sell it at a profit anytime later. This resulted in a staggering 22% of all homes in China being vacant, which amounts to 50 million, meaning that you could house entire populations of several big countries in them. What could go wrong? Seeing these trends, real estate companies naturally started to take on more debt to finance new projects to grow bigger and faster. Pre-selling apartments before the construction began was commonplace because of such high demand. The money collected from deposits would then allow them to take on loans to start yet more and more projects. But we've all seen images of newly built massive ghost towns in China for years now, so clearly something was off. It was a sign already that many of these projects got too ahead of themselves in places where the expected demand just didn't show up. So, noticing the potential disaster in the making, the ruling Chinese Communist Party decided to put some brakes and limit how much debt these companies could take on and how they could dispose of deposit money. The COVID crisis also had a strong impact by halting many construction projects, all the while the debt obligations had to be honored. If that wasn't enough to cripple a company based on such an intense business model, Evergrande also previously attempted diversification into other markets by launching a bottled water brand, electric vehicles, a soccer team, and many others. A lot of these side projects were failures and ended up being financial black holes for the company. So, these reasons taken together generated a liquidity crisis for a company that was dependent on a constant flow of new money for its operations. In order to mitigate the inability to borrow money as easily as before the new regulations kicked in, Evergrande decided to pre-sell more and more future homes for steeper and steeper discounts to collect money from as many people's deposits as possible that would help it achieve all the projects it started previously, without knowing exactly how it would deliver on all the new ones afterwards. Clearly, it became unsustainable, and that's when reality hit. Evergrande was rather ever pequeño and couldn't pay its creditors nor complete the millions of ongoing projects without a massive liquidity injection. The consequence was a halt in construction projects, angry buyers, and bad press. And even though the company showed enough assets to offset the liabilities on its balance sheet, the reality is that those assets are not liquid enough because it takes time to sell real estate, and their value on paper doesn't necessarily correspond to the reality. Boom, default. The 100-plus banks that loaned them money, the numerous contractors that accomplished work but haven't been paid, the bondholders that expected their principal payments, all could potentially end up holding the bag. Also, the millions of Chinese buyers who put deposits could never see their hard-earned life savings again, and at best be left with a skeleton of a flat in an unfinished building worth much less or nothing at all, ready to be demolished unless the government saves it for them. That's why you see images of protests inside Evergrande headquarters in Shenzhen, and even dramatic attempts of ordinary desperate people. And of course, there are also the 130,000 direct Evergrande employees and a few million indirect ones who might lose their jobs. But that's not all. Direct consequences also include those who have been supplying the Chinese real estate market with raw materials and such. Commodities like copper, oil futures, and iron ore are already taking a hit, with iron ore being crucial to, well, Australian economy. And that's just one example of how the contagion can spread from China to the rest of the world. Metaphor intended. Among the biggest international holders of Evergrande bonds, there are companies such as HSBC, BlackRock, and UBS Group, which risk never getting their principals back, although their exposure to Evergrande is relatively small compared to the size of their funds. For now, the Chinese government provided a small relief with a liquidity injection so that Evergrande can honor some of its payments, but which are a drop in the bucket in the grand scheme of things. Nobody knows how exactly the Chinese government will deal with the situation and who it will designate as the main loser. All kinds of options are predicted by analysts, but regardless of how managed the demolition of Evergrande will be, the bigger problem is that trust in the Chinese real estate sector will likely suffer, and that could have massive consequences. First of all, real estate construction might slow down dramatically, prices might drop, leaving thousands of people without jobs, erasing the savings of those who put deposits on projects that might never be finished, and depreciating the asset value of those who bought earlier, especially given that 78% of urban Chinese wealth is tied up in residential property. In all cases, it could harm consumption now that more people will have a negative outlook of the future, and sentiment is key when it comes to economic growth. Therefore, it could stall China's rise overall. And as the famous saying goes, when China sneezes, the whole world catches COVID. We're not there yet, but it's hard to see how we will not be, no matter whether this bubble is popped or carefully deflated. The best learning from this is, do not call your company ever something. Either you'll get stuck in a major canal blocking a good chunk of world's goods transit, or you'll risk generating an economic crisis. So, ever, no, but grande, yes, like Ariana. She's doing great. This video is brought to you by our online business courses. I do not ask for donations of any kind. I'd much rather sell you something that can actually be useful. If you want to learn how businesses innovate and build great companies, or how to create animated videos with PowerPoint like this one and many others on my channel, just take a look in the description. That's where you'll find all the links. My courses are bestsellers in their categories, so if they catch your interest, I guarantee that you will like them. And also you have a 30-day no questions asked money back guarantee, so there's no risk whatsoever. The only free thing I'm a sucker for is a like, so I'll highly appreciate it if you could just demolish this like button in a controlled fashion. I hope that you enjoyed this video and see you soon.